Today's panel features Cinda Williams Chima, the author of the Shattered Realms series. Django Wexler, the author of the Wells of Sorcery series.
Hello.
Breeana Shields, the author of the Bone Charmer series, which is now officially a series. And AdriAnne Strickland and Michael Miller, the authors of the Caine Chronicles series.
Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Hello.
So today's panel is going to discuss what it is like developing sophisticated and dynamic fantasy worlds. And they're going to discuss for a little bit, and then we're going to open it up for some questions from the audience. So, can each of you introduce your books a little bit that you're here today for?
We starting with me, or are we starting with
Django, you're first.
Okay. Hi, I'm Django Wexler. My YA book, my latest book, is Ship of Smoke and Steel. The brief pitch is that there's a girl who has a kind of powerful combat magic who gets dragooned by her government into an attempt to take over a legendary ghost ship to use in their navy or die trying. And she gets on board and discovers that the people living there have this kind of weird Lord of the Flies society with monsters, and she has to navigate that. So that's what I'm here for. It's super fun. This is my first YA book, and I'm really excited to be in this genre with so many awesome people.
Welcome, Django, to the world of YA.
Everyone's been super nice to me, so I'm really happy.
Yeah, it's a bunny eat bunny world. Well, I'm Cinda Williams Chima, and the book I'm here with is called Deathcaster. It's a cheerful book. It's the fourth book in the Shattered Realms series. Is anyone familiar with Seven Realms, Shattered Realms? My first series is set in the world of the Seven Realms, began with a Demon King, and then this is a second standalone series, but some of the same characters cross over. It's set about 25 years after the events of the Seven Realms series. And I guess you could, if I had a short pitch, it's when events in the Seven Realms go from bad to worse. It also gave me an opportunity. All of my books are about wizards behaving badly. I mean, what would you do if you had all this power? But in this series, I get to indulge my love of pirates and dragons as well. So.
I'm Breeana Shields. My book is called The Bone Charmer. It is about a world where bones are the source of all Okay, is that better? Bones are the source of all magic. They do all kinds of things, but one of the things they do is read the present, past, and future. And so in this book, there's a special bone ceremony called a kenning that all 17-year-olds get that determine their apprenticeship. And on the day of the main character's kenning, a bone breaks and her two paths split in two. So I like to call it a magical sliding doors. And you see in alternating chapters the two different paths, and only one can survive.
Our series, the Caine Chronicles with Shadowrun and Shadow Call, is about an ace pilot girl who harvests a dangerous energy source that she develops an affinity to, an ability to control, and about the new hire on her ship that turns out to have motives of his own and wanting to use her to his own ends, but yeah, things get bad. and also I have a fantasy, young adult fantasy coming out this fall that is about a girl who can walk through other people's souls as if they were houses, and the black door that follows her from soul to soul that she inevitably opens. So it's called Beyond the Black Door.
And I'm Michael Miller. I'm Adrianne's co-author in the Caine Chronicles, who can never remember the pitch. So I'm always like, could you do it, please? Because I just panic and start relating our books to food and what kind of food I like. And do you like it? And I don't know. And it's pizza or macaroni and cheese. So it's bad. But it's great to be here.
Yeah.
So to start us off, can you talk a little bit about your worlds? Because they're all very complex and intricate. I was really stunned by all of them, honestly. And can you describe how you keep track of their details, their history, their rules of magic? I know some authors keep a codex of this. What is that like for you?
I mean, for me, I definitely am on the codex keeping side. I draw maps. It's a legacy of my time as a D&D GM where I'm obsessed with maps. So I draw maps, and I do the sort of magical world building. This world is actually really interesting to me because I came up with this almost 15 years ago as part of a sort of long defunct project that never really got off the ground. And then I sort of went back through my notes and resurrected it. And a lot of it's different from that original version. The characters are mostly different. The basic concept is similar, but the world design is mostly the same. So I have all these world details that I don't remember inventing. So in a way, it feels kind of like almost more authentic than some of the other worlds I read, because I'm like, oh, I guess this is how we're doing things in this universe. But it's fun. It gives it a sort of nicely Baroque feel. I love it when there's stuff in a world that isn't immediately obvious to the plot, or rather immediately relevant to the plot, so it makes you feel like there's sort of more beyond where the story is. But yeah, I'm definitely the guy with a long codex of things and maps and notes and more notes, colors.
Yeah, did we have a wiki? I mean, we had, because we co-wrote, so we had shared Google documents, wikis of our own, just because we have multiple planets with multiple societies and religions and things like that, and because it's, we're each contributing to it, we definitely needed a system to keep track of it.
You can't just assume someone else has the same vision you do.
Yeah.
So no, we wrote everything down, and yes, we made a kind of online
hundreds
wiki,
of pages.
similar to Wikipedia, that I had fantasies of making live someday, but probably not.
Well, my first series was set in the magical world of Ohio. And I never really get credit for creating Ohio. But a lot of people don't, I mean, world building is always associated with fantasy, but no matter what kind of fiction you're writing, or nonfiction, actually, you have to try to put the reader in a world they may not have been to. For example, New Yorkers have never been to Ohio. Ohio's what you fly over to get to LA, or maybe Seattle if you have to go there. So I have to figure out what details will put readers there. Now, the Seven Realms series, I do have a map. I drew the first map of this world, and the good news is you don't have to be a good cartographer to write fantasy fiction. But I started it, it's probably kind of like you, to remember, so I could remember where I put things, because if you mess up, you get emails.
Yeah.
And there are some
So many
pretty, I'm not mentioning any, I don't know if any of you are included, there's some pretty obsessive people out there who will send me like this long list of questions or whatever. So every time they went somewhere, I would add it to the map. And actually, when I started writing these two series, I knew the world very, very well. It's kind of similar to what Django said. I have 500,000 unpublished words written in the Seven Realms. So when I submitted my first manuscript to my editor, she said, wow, this really seems real. And I said, yeah, I've spent a lot of time there, so I should know it really well. But I think the real challenge is including the details that put the reader there without overwhelming them. Because in my opinion, readers are a lot more likely to keep reading if they have a few questions than if they feel like they're hacking through a thicket.
I once drove to Ohio by accident.
That never happened.
How do you do that?
Turns out if you're aiming for Pittsburgh and you miss, there's no more exits before the Ohio border.
Oh, okay.
This series definitely put me in the story Bible camp. My first series, the world was simple enough I could keep track of it in my head. But this one, I started a story Bible with every detail and each kind of magic and how it worked and who had it. And as I've been writing the sequel, I've had to refer back to that a lot. I forget my own world. So that's invaluable, so I'm not thumbing through pages of a manuscript trying to find a detail.
Do any of you use Scrivener? Like, I love it to keep track of, oh my gosh, it's the best.
Yes.
I've just gotten very good with the find function in Word. So I'm constantly like, okay, what were that guy's eye color again? Like, okay.
Well, and what got me started keeping a story Bible was that I had a character whose eyes changed color unintentionally in each book, because there was a character, Alicia Middleton, that I never intended to bring back. She just had this one-off role, and then I liked her so much, I brought her back, and I'm like, did I ever describe her? And I'm looking like, no, I guess not. Well, I got an email. I'm just wondering what color Alicia's eyes are, you know, so,
Whenever you see something like that, a wizard did it.
yeah.
I have a co-author that has an unbelievable eye for detail themselves, so I could absolutely know that if I had to refer back to something and I was too lazy, I could just try and remember, get it wrong, and then I'd see the little red underline and hear like, this is spelled wrong. What do you think? That's not their name at all. So it was great.
I need to get one of those.
Yeah, it's very handy.
I actually have one reader who is kind of similar. He's constantly sending me these things, and eventually I just enlisted him and started having him do continuity edits. I was like, here, look, you might as well do this before the book comes out so we can fix these problems.
I guess George R. R. Martin has a guy like that.
Yeah,
that
probably several.
keeps track of all the details, and I think he's on the payroll. So,
So speaking of characters, because you mentioned it a few times, all of your books feature very large casts of characters. How do you breathe life into them? Because they're so dynamic, and make sure that they all have unique personalities, because they really leap off the page.
I think, I mean,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
I can, for ours, we had dual points of view. And so, and since we have so many planets and so many different cultures, I mean, to distinguish them all and really make them come alive, it's like, what were their histories and their backgrounds, and where are they from? And that was really important in our book for like, what worlds have power, which worlds have less, and the climates and the types of civilizations that developed in those particular geographies. So that having backgrounds like that really helped us.
I will say that I feel really strongly that part of writing is connecting to the reader's world. Like, no one is actually living the kind of things that we're writing about, right? So for it to matter to them, what transpires to the characters has to be understandable by us. So really, it's kind of the glory of the mundane, right? Like, world building is the same as character building. Is they come alive when the little details ring true, that those quirks are true, all these little things are true. So the better you know them, the more you can talk about their preference for coffee or whatever annoying quirk they have. So for us, bringing a crew of characters alive, remember we talked about it, and we really wanted them to each be not just cardboard cutouts, but weird in their own particular way. Like, we're all weird. So if you find out how weird someone is, that's great.
do you each write a point of view?
Yeah.
Building on that, one of the things that I really like about this book, a lot of times in a sort of fantasy setting, if you're in a sort of realistic setting, people don't travel that far, so you're kind of like, oh, everyone's kind of the same background unless you have some device to make that not happen. And in this book, the great thing is you have this big ship that goes around the entire world collecting people, and so I have a big cast, but they get to be from a whole bunch of different cultures, and I get to do sort of think up different fantasy variants of cultures and, you know, religions and world design and all that fun stuff, which again is like my D&D brain coming to the fore. I'm like, what kind of people would inhabit this biome, and like figure it out. So that's a lot of fun. And then, you know, they can have conflicts relating to the ways they view the world.
With the Shattered Realms, it has an extraordinarily large cast of viewpoint characters, even compared to the Seven Realms. And I started out with all of them on the page, you know, in the first book, and my editor's like, whoa, 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 whoa. And she said, this is just, you know, overwhelming. So with each of the first three books, we're focusing on different 2 or 3 characters, and then gradually they all come together, and it hopefully it gives the reader a little more opportunity to get to know a character before other people come on board. But then, you know, you get, I want to see more of this character, I want to see more of that character. So I don't know that there's any perfect solution. The other thing I do is I try to treat my cast of characters as if I had to pay them all. So, believe it or not, I try to keep my cast to a manageable size. And so if there's any time that one character can, oh, that character could do this too. You know, so I'm not just creating a random character for one event and then, you know, they're out. The other thing you can do is kill off characters, and that'll. I'm getting looked at.
But then you're really.
And you know that'll make your cast a little smaller.
Do you do that when your budget runs low?
You're fired. Yeah. I often build characters in layers, and so usually I have a really good sense of my point of view characters, but the side characters, each draft they get a little bit more themselves, and you can kind of in edits layer in more specific details like Michael was talking about, and they tend to just come alive draft after draft, so I kind of do it layer by layer until they feel real.
Does anybody do a lot of character work ahead of time? You know, they always say, know what's in your character's pockets and stuff.
We as a co-writing team, we definitely did. We had really extensive character files, just because if all of a sudden I took a character in a direction that Michael was like, wait a minute, like, that's not what I imagined. So we wanted to be literally and figuratively on the same page. So.
One of the awesome things that did happen is we were totally on the same page. Like, we wrote all these bios, but I went back and reread them recently, and there are traits that we both completely ignored. Like, the process, you know how when you write, something evolves on its own?
Yeah.
That still happens with two people. It's really interesting as long as you work off of one another.
I was going to say, I'm more on your page, where I tend to have the sort of broadest outlines of a character, but kind of learn about them through the writing.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means sort of once the book is done, sort of going back and revising the early chapters
Right.
to make them more in line with the later chapters. But often it feels very organic,
Yeah.
right? That you
Has
can,
it ever
you know, you
derailed
can-
things?
Yes. Oh, for sure. Sometimes,
Girl
I mean,
minded
you
it.
get this thing and you're like, okay, I'm developing this character gradually, and then you get to a plot point and you're like, this character, as I've developed them, would not do the thing that the plot now requires them to do. They wouldn't betray that person, or they wouldn't be that stupid enough to make this decision. And then you either have to change the character or you have to change the plot.
Dun, dun, dun.
So something that stuck out for me was most of your books, and maybe Breeana, it's more for your Poison series, but most of your books, one of the main characters comes from a disadvantaged background, and I found that really interesting. I guess it's more with Cole for AdriAnne and Michael at the end too. But can you explain why you chose this for your character and not just always coming from maybe the more obvious standpoint of always going with someone who has a path that's destined for them and chosen many, many years ago?
I think challenges make us more interesting as people and characters, and perfect characters are boring characters. And a lot of the flaws and things characters have to deal with come from those really challenging things. So I tend to find those kind of characters more interesting myself, more interesting to write, and more interesting to read about. So that's where.
I think, so we're both from Alaska, and there's a lot of resource exploitation that goes on up there, and that's really where the inspiration for Cole and the whole planet of hers came from. And so we just wanted to explore that, if like, kind of that small conflict in our state writ large across galaxies. And also Michael's point of view character is a prince from a very, powerful star system. So, and it was kind of, we really wanted that dynamic in pitching them together and shaking and seeing what happens.
To some degree, it was about choices. So, I mean, I feel that many of the original founding sort of epics are very much about someone who's coming from the background of being a farmer or a nobody or whatever.
Farm boy.
Yeah, exactly. And we wanted to have both choices, and how exactly are those people going to have to reconcile their paths with whatever choice they have, where destiny is not part of it. It's purely what you decide to make of it, for sure.
Yeah.
So I would say it was both.
I'm very fond of transformation stories, and it certainly makes me hopeful. I mean, I transformed myself into a writer fairly late in life, But so the thief and the princess, and they're both starting out, and both of them are transformed by the end of the series. Their language changes, their worldview changes, what they're capable of changes. And I love the notion that we're never finished, that it's never too late to, be different.
When you have a character who is sort of important, they're a king, they're a prince, they're the head of something or other, then it tends to lend a certain weight to the decisions they make, which can be a useful storytelling tool, but it can be more interesting if you come at it from the other way, and you're like, I have to make this character's decisions interesting without that advantage, right? So that this character has to be significant to the world, and they're not automatically significant to the world and the readers because they're the king, right? It's all about what's appropriate for the story. There are definitely, in my adult books, one of the characters is a nobody and one is the queen. So it depends what the individual story demands. But for this book, that was kind of the challenge that I set, is I'm like, I want this character to mean something even though they're not the destined hero or the king or whatever. And that was a lot of fun.
And to tag on that real quick, I mean, how many of us feel like we are understood by everyone around us, that we are, as everyone knows how awesome we really are, whatever the question
Nobody.
is. Nobody. Yeah, so to have a character you're reading about who gets discovered or gets to make choices that we might hope we would make in that situation is incredibly gratifying. It may not even be a conscious choice thing for the author always, but we all want to experience that story.
It's true.
So another thing that I noticed with all of your books is there was a major surprise, which when you read a lot, it can be hard to surprise your readers. So I was pleased that I found something that I did not see coming whatsoever. So how do you devise these twists and turns so that they're not obviously coming, but that a reader can see if they reread your book again with all the little hints that you wove in?
I mean, one thing I've learned is that is very subjective, because I've definitely done a twist and had some people tell me, man, that was amazing, it blew my mind. And then some people are like, that came out of nowhere and felt really unrealistic. And then some people are like, oh, I saw that coming a mile away, right? So like, you just have to be shooting for some kind of happy medium, because like, they're, different readers. And within each of those categories, there will be people who liked it or didn't like it. Like, some people hate it when you do something unexpected, and some people, that's all they really care about. So it's one of those things where you just kind of do the best you can. I feel like you try to make it work, but it's always going to be kind of a crapshoot.
Well, my grown son is still one of my beta readers, and if I can fool him, it's a pretty tough benchmark to reach. And if he calls me up and he says, Mom, I did not see that coming, and I'm like, yes. But very similar to what Django said, readers and writers are partners in story, and everybody comes to a book with a different background, a different reading history, and so some people will pick out those little clues along the way, and some won't. And the ones that do pick it out feel pretty smart. Hopefully they don't feel bored because they knew it was coming. And the ones who didn't see it, if they go back through, hopefully they can see the groundwork that you laid. I have a guy on Twitter that's reading back through my stories. He's like, huh, I see what you did there. And even when I wrote the 7 Realms, because I was pretty aware of what would happen in whatever became the Shattered Realms, for example, there are no pirates in the 7 Realms stories, but there are little references to pirates across the Indio and to Carthus, where the dragons are, and that sort of thing. And then in the new series, they become important in the story. So.
Yeah, we've done it both ways, where we've since we were writing together again, we had to plan a lot of stuff out. So it was almost hiding some of the twists, and as we went through, there's some big twists in book 2 that I won't spoil, and the hints are there in book 1, but we didn't want to make them too obvious, so it was going back and kind of burying them.
I was going to say, it's almost less about, is there a plot twist, as how do you avoid foreshadowing too much? How do you make sure what happens is completely organic, but you're not telegraphing everything all the time?
But then also, if I'm in, this is more in my individual stuff, if I'm feeling like I'm doing the predictable thing, I'll pull a fast one on myself. I'll be like, what can I do here that is going to surprise even me? And then if I need in revisions to go back and plant, things that make that work better, then I do that. But I'll try to surprise myself sometimes.
Yeah, it's always a delicate balance between enough foreshadowing that readers don't go back and find it unbelievable, and not so much that they guess it. And sometimes you get that right, and sometimes for some readers you don't. But that's another thing in revisions I try to work on is if someone saw it coming too soon, go back and take out some of that foreshadowing, and if it came out of nowhere, maybe add a little in. But it's a hard balance to strike.
I had an editor who was, editing my work, and she's like, well, I don't see why you did this, and I don't know about that, and why did this happen? So I walked her through the plot going forward, and then she was like, oh, this is too obvious. And I'm like, that's because you're like the second-time reader.
That's one of the reasons it's so hard to write, is because, it's so hard to emulate the mentality of someone who's actually coming to the material for the first time, especially when you're the writer and you're coming to it for the 100th time. It's hard. That's why beta readers and so on are so important, because it's so hard for the writer to imagine what someone will think, never having seen this before.
Yeah, to build on that, I know that for myself, Adri would notice things that I had put in specifically for foreshadowing. You don't even always know. I'd be like, why did he do this? I go, never mind, I'm cutting it out. Forget about it. And so the only thing I could ultimately come up with that really seemed to work was to drop the idea of foreshadowing really and just stay organic to the world, and having faith that because the characters were who they were, things were going to act out the way they would, and it would make sense to the reader when it ultimately culminated what it was supposed to culminate in, because otherwise that was too obvious.
So most of you have written multiple series, or you're starting a new series, or your book series has just ended. Can you talk a little bit about transitioning between series and having to, or I guess with Cinda going back to a previous series, but having to transition your mindset between your various fantasy worlds?
Well, I only have 2 worlds I've dealt with, Ohio and the 7 realms. But I do find that I wrote these 2 series so they could stand alone. And I find a really different viewpoint between people who've read the 7 realms and then they read the Shattered Realms, or people that just read the Shattered Realms first. And probably the biggest example of that is that I killed off a beloved character, and not only did I do that, I did it right at the beginning of the Shattered Realm series, and so I had all these reams of people who were angry with me, but the people who had not read the 7 realms read the Shattered Realms. They just read along, and they were, perfectly happy. I don't know this person, go ahead. So you do, even if the series are standalone, there's a lot of baggage attached to the first series that is carried into the second series, and it sharpens the emotional hits along the way. And I find that a lot of people who've read both series are like, no, you have to read 7 realms first. And that's kind of daunting to expect people to plow through 8 books.
Yes.
So I tried to give people an off-ramp, so you could read 4 books and then 4 books, or you could read this 4 books and then go back. So I've found that challenging, but I have been annoyed as a reader with, I won't mention who, but people who write these really, really long, never-ending series, and not only that, it takes them more than a year to write the next book. And by the time I, get the next book, I've forgotten all these people, so I will mention that if anybody can't remember some of the characters or places or whatever, on my website, I've got a table of characters. I've got a glossary of thieves' slang, which has been important in these stories. And, lists of places and the guilds and all this sort of thing. So there's always that kind of cheat sheet available. Or you can read, what's that site, Book Series Recaps? I don't know if any of you've ever visited that, but it's a good shortcut if you don't want to reread.
I need some fans to create wikis for my books. I think it was Daniel Abraham who was saying that people created an Expanse wiki, and he's like, it's great, now I can go look things up, because they're way more obsessive than I am. I love doing multiple worlds, just because doing world design is one of my favorite things to do, so shifting between worlds is fun. I'm always, starting a new series is a little daunting sometimes, but it's also amazing because you get to sort of paint with a really broad brush, which is fun. As you go on in a world, it gets more and more constrained by what you've done before and the need to remain consistent. And, at least for me, there's always this urge to be like, well, I want to do a world where everyone lives in giant mushroom airships. And I can't fit that into here. And so for me, one of the best things about fantasy is getting to do new series.
Tell me more about that world.
Yeah.
Yeah, I found it really energizing to switch to a new series. It was really fun to be in a completely different world. And yeah, the first book is always a lot of fun until you've laid down so many rules that the next books get harder. But I found it just an energizing change of pace and really fun.
It's like a trade-off, like she was saying, because there's like, the later books tend to have more emotional punch because you've been living with these characters and you know them, but at the same time, you're not as free in the world building and design.
I find Ohio very constraining.
Yeah, it was. I think I wrote this book between our series.
Which is insane. Can I just point out that's very aggravating?
No, so it was really fun to go to a completely different world, and this is straight fantasy. These are like science fantasy mixes, and so just to go to have a little playground and do my own thing, it was really fun, refreshing.
So you took a vacation.
Yes.
And I'm in the middle of my acid test to prove I can write a book without AdriAnne cracking the whip. So we'll see. The biggest challenge for me has always been that, yes, other worlds are so tempting, you want to switch halfway through a story. You go, oh, but I just had this other great idea. I could work on that too.
I didn't let him do that.
So I think we're going to open it up to the floor to have the audience ask some questions. So if you have a question, if you wouldn't mind lining up, possibly behind the microphone that's in the middle of the room there. If nobody has questions, I guess I can ask another question.
Come ask us questions, you want to. It can be about anything. Well, almost anything. I can't promise I'll answer certain questions.
Not on. Is there a switch there?
We could repeat it.
Okay, good.
I'll just project, that's
Yeah.
fine.
Wow.
So this is specifically for the co-authors. How does that work?
Honestly, I want to know too.
We all want to know.
I have somebody who's assisting me in world creation and character creation. I mean, he has his hands fully in the pot, but he's like, I don't want any of the credit. But at the same time, it's like some of his characters that are truly his characters, I can't get inside their heads. So when I need dialogue, I'm like, hey, write this with me.
No, we got the mic.
Well, I mean, it helped that we were both writing it, not trying to get into characters that we, didn't have some proprietorship over it. But yeah, so to start, we wrote 2 different POVs, because we didn't, at this point, we could write the same point of view character now,
so,
2
yeah.
books in. But at the beginning, we weren't entirely sure. So that's why we had our own character. We had the most say over that voice. And if somebody had, you know, a thought or suggestion, you know, you take that into account. But like, you know, Cole is mine and Nev is Michael's. And as far as all the secondary characters, we kind of like picked our battles, like things that were really important to us. There's a big crew on the spaceship, and so we each kind of had our babies among the crew there. And but yeah, we would have our things that were really important to us, and then it was just a dialogue, a discussion after that, and a lot of writing in Word, where you can both write at the same time, the online Word program. And yeah, so I think having 2 points of view helped, and just lots of discussions and kind of picking your battles.
I do think, I mean, picking your battles is a really important point, because anytime you enter any collaboration, I mean, writing, graphic design, I mean, you could literally name it the partnership. It's really helpful to go into it with an assumption that there will be disagreements, and what's your plan for when that happens. And really, to some degree, you just have to say, I'm going to be okay with 90% of either the compromises or what that person wants to do. Just even if it's not what I want to do, it's not my world in that sense, I'm just like, okay, that's fine. You feel about it more strongly than I do. And every once in a while, you have to know really well for yourself what you feel is absolutely central to the character, to the story. And I mean, I would say we've only had 2 or 3 of those conversations, and generally just took the other person going, this is super important for XYZ reasons. And because, you know, we had gone into it with the assumption that for whomever it was more important would win out at the end of the day, that was fine, and we went on. I mean, we never had a blow up. I will, just because I run a small business in my day-to-day work, and I have had business partners, I will just say that if you're going to publish your work and this person has put a lot of effort into it with you and they're not credited and you have no legal agreement, and all of a sudden you're super rich and famous, that could get really ugly really fast, even though they're super good friends. Okay, all right, just want to put that out there, because there are cases where people assume because their friends are really close that it'll just be all okay, and if you're good, okay.
It's not the type of a friend is helping me. This is a partner is helping me.
Awesome.
So we will cover the legal things later. We have discussed things thoroughly in that sense.
I know why I'm coming up to the mic.
I think it was working.
Yeah, I think it's working
Hello?
now.
It's
Yeah.
working.
Hi.
So I'm curious for all of you what your process is like when you're starting out in a new world or new series. Do you find yourselves developing the world building and then coming up with the people to populate it, or do you come up with characters and then build the world around them?
For me, sometimes I have world building ideas and that comes first, but the vast majority of the time I know what kind of story I want to tell, and I end up designing the world to support that story. Because I don't like being in a situation where you have to kind of fight the world to tell the story you want to tell. You have to come up with exceptions and reasons why people can't do things. So like in this book, good example is that I knew it was going to be about a teenage protagonist, and I knew I wanted her to have magic, and so that means that the magic in this book can't be the sort where you have to study for 60 years to be able to do it, because obviously it's not going to work. Or in the Shadow Campaigns books, I knew I wanted them to be about a kind of sort of gritty military action in a fairly realistic mode, which meant that the magic in those books had to be a little more subtle and personal. It couldn't be the kind of, you know, Wheel of Time, Malazan Book of the Fallen magic where demigods can shatter armies with a wave of the hand, because if they can do that, who cares about all the sort of intricate military stuff that was what I was really trying to make the story about. So in that sense, I tend to come up with not even the characters or the plot, but just kind of like the kind of thing that's going to be happening in the story. So like in this book, it's going to be about marching armies and musketry. In this book, it's going to be about individuals or small groups fighting giant monsters, and then the rest of the book sort of supports that.
Well, to be honest, the Seven Realms was inspired by a book series, maybe you've heard of it, Game of Thrones. And I was reading it when it was just a book series and not on HBO back in the 90s. But I loved what George R. R. Martin did with characters, because none of his characters were all good or all bad. Even if you disagreed with what they did, you could see why they did it, what their motivation was. And he made me hate a character, and then he made me love that character. Talking about Jaime Lannister. You know, and of course I'm like, how did you do that? I'm going to do that myself. And so a lot of it was, a lot of times I start with character, but I was also enthralled with this, you know, 7 realms, 7 kingdoms. Didn't really mean to do that, but yeah, and how a history can drive drama in the present, because in the 7 realms, there's this whole, I mean, it's very, very common in fantasy to have this magical apocalypse, you know, back in the day in which everything changed, and the shadow of that is still looming over everyone in the present. And we have 3 groups in the Fells, the Vale folk, which includes the royal family, wizards, and the clan folk, who, as Hon Alistair puts it, cannot agree that water is wet and the sky is blue. So there's a lot of conflict built into the world itself. And then I, you know, put these flawed people into it. So it's very, I mean, when I started the 7 Realms, obviously I knew the world really well, so there was a lot more world building than usual, because, you know, I have these 500,000 words, so I don't usually do that.
I almost always start out with some kernel of an idea, a spark of an idea that I want to explore, and then build the world and the characters around that. So for Bone Charmer, I wanted to do an alternate, like a split reality thing for a long time, and it took me a long time to figure out the right magic system and the right story to tell that. But that's always really fascinated me, how one tiny choice could change everything and make everything different. And so usually it's something I'm kind of obsessed or fascinated with, some idea I want to explore, and then the world and the characters kind of come organically out of that.
Yeah, I've had it happen both ways, actually, where I had a character in mind, or kind of, yeah, that I really wanted to build a world around and kind of let them lead that. And then I've just had, you know, like kind of a setting pop into my mind that's the seed idea for, you know, and then I'm like, oh, who can populate this really, really cool world?
Like Bristol Bay.
Yeah, I think more it was like, I mean, yeah, did we start with the characters or the world first? I think we wanted, yeah, this big resource conflict to play out among planets, and a girl who could wield that, you know, resource kind of like magic, you know, and that was kind of one idea that came. And then for this one, it was, yeah, I wanted, yeah, a girl who could walk through people's souls. and also, yeah, like kind of simultaneous with that, she lives in a really highly sexualized world, and she's actually asexual. So those things were like kind of one package. But yeah.
I know that for me, everything starts with emotional beats in my head. Like, stories are always popping into my head as I do everything throughout the day. So if I'm talking to you and I look distracted, it might be because something has popped into my head and I'm distracted. And so those emotional beats, I mean, I think that what everyone else said is true. You have to build the world around that. There has to be a reason why you're not setting it in Ohio. It can't just be because, or I suppose it could, but it would have a lot less emotional resonance. And so the book I'm working on now actually started off as a historical fiction book, and then it just didn't jive with that. What I wanted to just wasn't going to work, so it switched to medieval fantasy. And yeah, I don't know, but I guess in the case of Shadowrun, we did start with the world first, so that wasn't true.
Hello. First, I just want to say, Breeana, I'm super excited to read The Bone Charmer, and I'm like
thank you.
physically restraining myself from running up there and grabbing that copy.
They're free today too. They're ARCs, so you know.
I need to find them. I don't know where they are. Anyway, I spend all my free time reading and reviewing books online, and so I'm just wondering if you guys have any experiences or really awesome people that you've interacted with on Bookstagram or Book Twitter or anything, and just like how interacting with that form of social media has influenced your writing careers.
It actively interferes with. I have to make a real effort not to get online when I'm on deadline. What really kills me is that there are all these authors that have attached to their name on Twitter who's on hiatus, but they're on Twitter, and I'm like, hang on, what? I thought you were taking a time out.
It's hard, man.
Yeah, and
breaking yourself from that.
oh,
It's more hopeful than
and
actual.
you'll just think, and there's the research trap, because I'll think, well, I just really need to research how the Vikings made a fire, whatever, and then before you know it, you're down this rabbit hole.
How do you get out of that rabbit hole? I really need to know.
Sometimes I turn off the Wi-Fi and I just keep a list of research questions on the desk next to me, so I know I won't forget, and then I will, when it's research time, then I can do it. But see, I was born to, there was no fan fiction or Bookstagram. I mean, when I was younger, and I've been writing since 3rd grade, but I think, I love the notion of fan fiction. I was doing something more like live action role plays with my friends, of books and movies and stuff. And now I will tell you, my son said, never tell anyone that, Mom. That's so nerdy. But that, yeah.
You're going to tell someone this is the place.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Hear it.
You're our people, right? But yeah, so I didn't have those advantages, and the notion of being able to build a community as you're starting out as a writer, if you can find the right community, I think it would have been so helpful.
It's made conventions a lot more fun, because I feel like every convention feels kind of like a reunion where I get together with a bunch of the people that I know from Twitter but not anywhere else, and you hang out in the bar or go out to dinner or whatever, and that's it. That sounds sort of flippant, but it's actually really important. Like, I feel like I have made genuine relationships in those social spheres that I would never have managed in any other context.
And writing is usually such an isolated thing,
it
so
can
it's
be
like,
such
oh,
a lonely
my people.
business.
Yeah, it's great to make connections. And the review part is a double-edged sword, because there's nothing better than finding a reader that connected with your book and loves it and having them tweet and hear about it. And there's nothing worse than finding a reviewer who hated your book, thought it was the worst thing ever.
Do you guys read your reviews, like all of them?
Less and less, but
I have
yeah.
weaned myself off it. After 10 books, I think I'm finally done.
Yeah. I try to stay away, but I'm not successful. So, how about you?
I read them. I like all of them.
It's like candy. Are you kidding?
Yeah, even when somebody hated it, I want to know why they hated it. It doesn't, some people it really bothers and it can throw off their writing. If I had somebody over my shoulder critiquing it as I was writing something, that would be bad, but luckily I don't. It's not published yet. But afterward,
The problem is the bad reviews always make me want to argue with them.
That's true.
Never do that as a writer.
Don't
Never,
understand.
ever. And
Ever.
it's frustrating.
And not everyone is going to like your book. And that is one of the hardest lessons, I've had. I don't like every book I read. And all I have to do is read, on Goodreads, read down a whole page of reviews of the same book. And one person will say, the beginning dragged. And somebody else will say, I stayed up all night and called off work so I could finish this. And somebody will say there was too much detail, there wasn't enough detail. That usually means I've hit the sweet spot, because some people are there's too much, some people had questions, some people are fine with questions. So, but it's still, I'm such a pleaser, you know, that I know that not everyone's going to like my book. And I just have to accept that.
So we have time for one more question.
When you kill off a character, is that something that you plan, or is it like, oops, what did I do? Just do?
Oops.
I almost always plan it. At least if it's a character that is important enough to be in the outline. Sometimes
Outline?
my last outline was 20,000 words. If it's an important character, then it's usually planned, although I try not to make it seem that way, because that can be one of those things where if you foreshadow it too hard, then it becomes really laughable. But I think it changes the story, so it's important, right? You know, that these things should have weight, so people need to react to them. And it's not just something you do for the shock value. It's, you know, it has to affect the other characters if it's going to be meaningful. So that makes it an important part of the plot.
Yeah, I've never done it unplanned.
Yeah.
Never done it.
Unplanned, yeah, I've always planned
You've
it.
done planned
Planned
hits.
My hits are always planned, carefully.
I think there's, yeah. No, we've never stumbled into killing a character.
I don't want my characters thinking it was an accident. Yeah, I don't care that much.
Well, and I think that, I mean, you know, because readers get involved with characters, it's unfair to kill someone for flippant reasons. And the character that I killed off in the Shattered Realms, I had already written part of that story before I began the Seven Realms, but at the time, I didn't know this character. And so I'm like, you know, off him, that's fine, that's a great story starter. But after writing 4 books, I knew this character. And I actually wrote 2 books and went back to Ohio because I couldn't face going forward with that part of the story. And then I tried every way to kind of keep it off stage. My editor was having none of that. And so if anyone is at all interested, I wrote a blog about, you know, why, if you look on my website, you can see a link to my blog. And but I mean, it also depends on the reader, because a seasoned reader will know that that happens. But for some people, for younger readers, sometimes that's the first time a good guy got killed off in a story. And they're just not anticipating that. And I was actually at a panel, and George R. Martin was on a panel with Tad Williams, and I don't know. And I asked this question, well, no, the panel was killing off characters. And I said, well, what do you do if you're hearing from all these angry readers? And Tad Williams said, I tell them to shut up or I'll kill off some more. And I don't think I can do that.
Okay, well, I think that's about all we have for today, for today's panel. All these authors are going to be signing at tables 1 and 2 in the writer's block, which is going to be just across the hall. If you brought books, that's awesome. They're happy to sign them. And if you didn't bring their books, but something about one of them really sparked your interest, there's going to be most of their books on sale right next door to the tables at the University Bookstore booth. So go ahead and stop by. I also have books by other authors that are going to be on panels throughout the weekend. So thank you for coming to this panel. I hope you enjoyed it, and please join me in thanking the authors for spending time with us today.
Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
Awesome.